Friday afternoon, folks, downtown Honolulu. Ted Ralston here on our show, Where the Drone Leads. Welcoming to our show, frequent flyers, Chuck Devaney in Washington, D.C. Chuck, welcome on board again.
Thanks for having me on the show again, Ted.
And thanks for being here. And Gregg Nakano, who's escaped the punishment of being on this show for about the last year. We got him back. Greg, thanks so much for coming on board here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So well, that's good. And by the way, this show is, and Think Tech Hawaii is not ever shying away from technology. And let me just tell you about something we got going on here. Greg asked before, as we were setting this up, can we please find a way to coach him on when he's talking too much or talking too little? So Greg's actually wearing a wire. And I have a control here, right here, and we can cause Greg to up or down the intensity and the nature of his conversation. And so can you, watching this from the outside. You can tweet us at ThinkTechHI, and you can also control Greg with a plus or minus to get more or less out of him, as the case may be.
Thank you.
Greg, well, once again, welcome aboard, man. It's cool. Chuck Devaney is representing UAS Academy, where he works in Washington, D.C., and he's taken all the training he's done to us and the learning he's done here at UH, and he's taken it across the country into DC, and it's fantastic. Chuck, we want to tax that knowledge you've got here in a minute once we hear Greg's vision. And Greg is representing not just himself, but many visions of resilience and dedicated effort towards improving the quality of life in the Pacific. And I think that's really a totally fantastic outcome and that we're going for here, Greg. So let's start off a little bit. Just have Chuck advise Greg of what's been going on since you guys were last together, probably here on the show. And Chuck, how are things going in DC?
Things are going well, Ted. I've got a lot of different builds on my bench right now. A couple of different multi-rotor prototypes. I've got a couple of fixed wings that are ready to go for a couple of different applications, and we're gearing up for Trident Spectre in May.
Okay.
So, that is our next big, one of our next our big events. We have a North Texas SAR event that we're going to be supporting as well with our command and control center. But after that, we'll be focusing primarily on Trident Spectre.
Okay, we'll try to get you focused back on the Pacific here once we hear what Greg's all about. Let me just suggest also, Chuck, just coming out today in the news, the news on UAVs is like 100 pieces every day about new things. There's a move in Congress to get the definition of recreation under the model airplane rules expanded to include STEM and education and those pieces that are a different form of recreation than simply flying. If your recreation happens to be analyzing intelligent data from an overhead sensor, or if your recreation happens to be designing a flight control system, those all fit within the expanded definition of recreation as it's being pushed forward today, which would carve out a much more robust space of sort of self-managed operations under the community-based organization. So everybody who's listening to this and wants to be part of that, Chuck, including you and your organization, we need to get behind that and help that definition be more complete and go forward in a way that allows this sort of educational and STEM component to grow more rapidly than we may have seen it in the past. Anyway, that's just an editorial note here for all those who are UAV aficionados here. But Greg, the man of many visions, tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about for the Western Pacific, which I think you actually introduced on this show about 2 years ago. But this is now the next evolution in that thinking.
Well, it's simple, but it's maybe a little bit complex. I think.
Wait, simple and complex. There we go. That's Gregg Nakano right there. There's no simple thing in there. That's all complex.
Sweet and savory.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually part of what I'm trying to do to finish up my graduate certificate in Masters of Geoscience. But what I really wanted to do was look at how is climate change, specifically sea level rise, going to affect the small Pacific islands. And then as those islands have to adapt and the people have to migrate or adjust, how is that going to affect the national security of the region? And so that's where drones really come in, I think, is that.
But if you can explain that for a minute. I just hit Greg with the wired signal here, so we need to stop a little bit and get an explanation. So the idea is that sea level rise or atmospheric temperature rise, whichever one, is going to influence the Western Pacific Islands,
Right.
perhaps more rapidly than other places. Certainly more rapidly there than in Kansas. And if I got my geography right.
Right.
And so we need to understand what those factors might be in order to prepare to take some intelligent action.
And I think a lot of people at University of Hawaii who I've been learning from know this much, much better than me. But from what I understand, the elements are that global climate change has an average temperature rise, but it affects different areas differently. And especially in the small Pacific Islands, what you have is you have a very vulnerable population because an inch, 2 inches, 3 inches is really going to push people to a smaller and smaller sliver of land that they're living on. They can't, not like Hawaii, you can't just move back from the coastline up into the mountains.
Or Kansas.
Or Kansas. They're kind of stuck. And so the question then is, if you have your water, your sanitation, your power structures in areas that might be inundated by sea level rise, how do you adjust in these new conditions?
And so we really need to find out what the status of that situation is today in order to understand the rate of change and the consequence of predict the consequence of factors. That's where UAVs come into the game.
Absolutely.
That's why Chuck's on the show.
That's right.
And Chuck, can him smile. So Chuck, let's talk a little bit about how islands in the Western Pacific, which could be atolls and they could be islands themselves, how the geospatial reality of those, including the infrastructure that supports them, water, power, the sewage, if it may be, harbors, ports, things like that.
Right.
How would we think of collecting that kind of information with perhaps a mix of fixed wing for large areas and unmanned for small?
Well, first of all, Greg, I got to say good luck because your topic is very broad. And if you could find a way to narrow that down to a couple of questions, I think you'll probably get done a lot quicker, just from experience from a recent grad. Back to your question, Ted, as far as the geospatial component, a lot of these islands and atolls that are inhabited that we speak of don't have a local datum or any way to have any sort of elevation data, so they can't make predictions. So someone like the King of Tuvalu wants to know what kind of time he has so he can move his people to some sort of pre-disclosed location, away from where, they might be having a lot of damage from, say, king tides. We're seeing a lot of damage from king tides at this time. So how do you provide these people with the elevation data they need to do the Monte Carlo modeling for inundation? Well, they can't afford expensive LiDAR. Sometimes you can't get the LiDAR there because the airplane can't get there. There's going to be a landing strip, so they can't refuel. So you have to come up with different methodologies to get these people the information in a cost-effective manner, because you're predominantly dealing with developing countries.
So it sounds like to me what Chuck's going to lead us to is that a fixed-wing UAV of some kind with a good camera on it, or maybe multiple cameras, flying a perimeter, perhaps a quarter mile along the seacoast. The first quarter mile is going to be the most important, I would think, and inland will be, we can consider that a secondary target. But the first quarter mile, first half mile, a swath along the seacoast might be a good place to start.
And it doesn't have to be expensive. I don't think it needs to be that expensive. I mean, we've already demonstrated what we can actually accomplish with the most minimal technology, and it can be robust. With a simple point and shoot camera that you can buy at Best Buy, and a fixed wing that that I built in the past, but now are sort of being produced on a mass level more affordably. We can put together these packages, provide the training, and empower these developing nations to kind of deal with the problem on their own, rather than have somebody come in and hold their hand.
That's pretty cool.
You're also dealing with a lot of cultural issues. Maybe they don't want any outside help, but to empower somebody to kind of deal with the issue on their own, I think is kind of where it's at.
You know, that's great, and at some point in time in the future, we'll pick up Ethan Allen, who is actually on the 2 o'clock slot for this day at Think Tech. And he's right now, just came back from Majuro. He's in Chuk at this point in time. And we'll get him on the show because he's involved with the resilience aspect of this. Resilience is a factor here. In fact, what we're talking about, these measurements turn into resilience factors. And he's very interested in that. There's a book outside. I'll make you look at it break time, and you'll see every piece. You'll see the pie sliced in many, many, many ways, all of which is resilience. And then I'd like to get Brennan on the show, or I'm not sure if he's Brendan Brennan or Brennan.
Brennan.
He knows who he is, and he's been on the show before. He's an educational architect thinking about this problem at the K-12 level and thinking about how STEM is the way that these kind of problems can be looked at and then worked on in the future. So we'll get neither of them available today, but we'll call you back in a couple of weeks and we'll bring them on the show and have that discussion together. But we'll take where Chuck's taking us, which is we can go ahead and do this collection. It could be done with fairly existing technology without having to invent anything new. And I like his idea of empowering the local population to take that on their own. And Chuck, Greg's building budget now in his head. He can look at him and tell that. So you're looking at what, a couple $1,000 for the equipment?
I would say per unit, probably a couple $1,000, and you probably want to get more than that. And then you got to think about how you're going to process the data. You got to think about how you're going to get to these areas and deliver it. So, you know, initially it might not look as attractive to design the entire process and the packages. But I think once the expedition kits are put together and easily replicated, I think that it will be very cost effective.
So looking at a couple $1,000 setup, and probably need 2 setups, I would imagine, Chuck, so you have a spare?
Yeah, at least 2 setups and some spare parts. You know, they're going to need to maintain this. It's not like they can go down to Hobbytat. I just plugged Hobbytat. I hope they appreciate that. And they buy some parts. You know, you can't do that when you're in Tuvalu or Chuk. You know, so you have to think about the serviceability and the robustness of the aircraft itself. And maybe it'll only last a year. And also training is going to be a huge component. There's going to have to be some sort of money, or somebody's going to have to fund somebody to go there and train the 2 guys in the truck, Ted. You know, back to that 3 years ago when we were trying to figure this out when we were in the Philippines.
Okay, so we got one item on the table, which is about $5,000 for the flying equipment. We'll need to talk about the processing and then talk about the logistics and this kind of support beyond that. And let's pick that up until we get back from our first break here and help Greg build his budget and then generate support to get some cash flow in his direction.
There's your topic, Greg. There's your topic.
All right,
Make it go. Okay.
Namaskar and hello. My name is Anu Hitchell. My show is called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. In it, we go beyond outrage to discuss solutions to global problems on climate change facing people, nations, and the world. Join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock on Think Tech Hawaii. Aloha and bye-bye.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on Think Tech. Aloha.
Here we go again, folks. Ted Ralston, our guest Gregg Nakano, and Chuck Devaney in Washington, D.C. on Where the Drone Leads. We're talking about that drone leading us to the Western Pacific Islands to support the discovery of information that's essential in order to prepare for the things that we know are coming, sea level rise and temperature rise in general, and the effect that has on the populations and the whole social structure of the Western Pacific societies. Gregg Nakano's got that in his mind. Chuck Devaney's helping us figure out how to budget this up. As we broke for the first break, we had $5,000 listed down for equipment. Chuck, that would probably include some spares and such. Now we need to think about a couple of people going down with them and some training.
Yep. Processing too. So they're going to have some equipment that's going to be able to handle a lot of data relatively quickly. And also the training component, they're going to need to be, they're going to need to maintain it. And they're also going to need, the thing can't stay on the wall and wait for a disaster to happen. This thing needs to be exercised. Battery management, so on and so forth. So they might as well figure out some sort of environmental monitoring component to incorporate into the program. That can bring in a STEM-based program, or if there's any sort of academic element, which I'm sure there is in any of these countries that we speak of in the South Pacific. We could incorporate that, and then also within the STEM component, maybe they can start building their own stuff. Maybe we start shipping them parts, and we start putting together programs where they're actually doing some sort of land, air, sea robotics, like a laser program.
That's exactly the connection we're looking for here. If you go back up a little bit, Chuck, to the processing, the basic essential processing, the digital elevation model, or the surface elevation model, whatever you want to call the three-dimensional portrayal of the surface, looking at stability and change and this sort of thing. Chuck, what would you think of in terms of the software that would get that job done?
Through my entire graduate career, I always used Agisoft Photoscan. I've had, a lot of experience with Pix4D, but it's going to have to be something that's going to be relatively cost effective. It's not going to cost them a lot of money down the road. So I would probably recommend, Agisoft to start out, because you can get one license and it'll stay with you. And I think you get a couple of upgrades beyond that. Pix4D is a very powerful, very user-friendly software, but it doesn't seem to be as cost-effective for the type of data that you get at.
I just thought of something. Paycom is here. Greg's heavily associated with Paycom. In some of the worlds of squad level optimization of UAS and platoon level optimization of UAS, things that Chuck's talking about, the determination of the surface elevation in the 1,000-meter radius around the squad, that is now actually practiced in the foxhole with a combat laptop. You just take the SD card from the UAV, and which is flown in a random pattern, and stick it in, and in 20 minutes the system does it for you. No longer do you need, it's been simplified to the point of getting past all the file preparation and other issues that we're used to in the laboratory. So tying in Paycom here and tying in this functionality, which does exist, is a theme we should maybe pursue in parallel.
That, theoretically, that could be really good. I understand that there's a brand new memorandum of understanding between University of Hawaii and Paycom, and that disaster risk reduction is one of the elements that's inside that MOU. So maybe there's a way we could tie this into disaster risk reduction, climate change, and then the global health component.
And then turn this into an annual exercise, or associated with the exercise framework that exists within Paycom today, if we have any influence over them. So Chuck, Pix4D or or Photoscan, the two that you were thinking of here, $10,000 a license, something like that, to get going?
$3,500 for the Agisoft. You're looking at anywhere from $5,000 to $9,000 for the Pix4D license. But
okay.
You might be able to, if it's program development, if it's capacity building, you put that package together as a capacity building component. There might be a way that they might be able to support, a field test, like an initial effort.
Yep.
For capacity building.
And one laptop to house this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
okay.
There might be that. There are some open source programs out there as well that might work, but they're a little bit more cumbersome, and you're not going to get a result very quickly. So if you're trying to empower the two guys in a truck that might be local law enforcement or EMTs or what have you that are going to be, operating this stuff, you probably want to keep it simple and user-friendly to begin with.
And Chuck just hit another important thing here. And of course, I'm going to turn the thing up on you in a minute, Greg, to have you talk. But getting the public safety people as Chuck's implying, on the island or on the atoll, involved here and doing the work, so that the leave behind is that functionality in their hands, the equipment and the software and the knowledge in their hands. What a gift back to the population. Not only the data, but the ability to continue recording that data in the future.
I think, Chuck, when you talked about empowering and sustainability, I think that's probably the real key, is that it doesn't matter if you can parachute down with some high tech, but if the people don't understand how to use it or continue it, then it's not really useful. You know, if we're able to find the way with the UH-PACOM MOU to build this capacity, maybe the University of Hawaii could reach out to the College of the Marshall Islands, and then maybe we could make it a triangle relationship, so it's not just UH and PACOM, but maybe it's the local universities and colleges, you know, on the Pacific Islands themselves, and maybe we could expand it that way.
Okay, and then with that as a setup, Chuck, what's it going to cost and take in terms of time to get you and perhaps some other person of equal skill, the two guys in a truck, down to the Marshall Islands to get the operation spun up and going to the point where it's self-sustaining?
You know, it probably at this point would be pretty affordable. It'd probably cost a plane ticket, some room and board. The charge for my time will be minimal because I'm on a fellowship right now. So chances are my fellowship will probably cover that component. So it'd probably just be shipping of the equipment, development of the equipment, and just getting us there, really.
How much time do you think you're going to need on-site in order to get started, considering the experience you had in the Philippines in terms of the issues of the socialization and this sort of thing, and the importance of bringing the leadership into the picture? Given some social time and then some operational time, what do you think? 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get?
2 weeks. 2 weeks would probably be plenty, and it's going to depend on how many people we want to you know, enable with this stuff. So not everybody's going to be a pilot. You know, that's just the way it is. Some people just don't want to spend the time. They don't have the confidence to be the pilot. So you have to figure out who is going to be the best fit for the certain roles. The ground station operator is going to be just as important. They have a huge role to deal with on their own. Visual observers, people that are going to deal with the information. So right now we've put together a package, which is basically a tripod with a camera on it. And then we've got a guy behind it taking pictures. So the next thing is we're going to process it. We've figured that out. So what are they going to do with the information after that? They've made the model. They've put it onto a hard drive, and now we've stopped there. So now who's going to deal with that information and start making decisions?
I think what we have to do is determine that information architecture right here, right up front, before anything ever happens. That's got to start with that. What is the information? Who's going to secure it, protect it, keep it from getting into the wrong hands, and stamp it with some time code so that we know at what point it expires.
Right.
So over to you, Greg, on that one. I'm going to hit the wire here.
I've never had that challenge before, but I think maybe if we're able to reach out to some of the other people who are already working on disaster risk reduction. So I understand that USAID has some representatives. They're working with the local disaster responders. So maybe there's a way that we could...
On the islands or in the area?
Right, in Marshall
Okay.
Islands right now. So maybe there's a way that we could open up a line of communication with them right now and say, okay, we're in planning stages, but we'll get the information, we'll do the flights, and then if they can secure the information, whether it's with themselves or the embassy or something like that, or got to make sure that the local government is getting it.
Exactly, it's their information, really.
Right.
You know, when it comes down to it, it's their stuff, and if they want us to disseminate it to those other people, then they'll give us their blessing, and it'll be our kuleana to do so.
But that can be done right now before Chuck even leaves Washington, D.C. And let's see, we're talking about not reinventing the wheel if possible, using an existing data architecture that might exist for public safety, for USAID, for Pacific Command, or for World Bank or United Nations, whoever it may be that sits on those things.
Exactly, and Ted, so something that we do at the Academy and is a major part of our model is training the trainers. So when we are done, we want to be able to train people to do this. So you don't have to keep flying us out there to different, I mean, I would love to go visit every South Pacific island. Don't get me wrong, but, you know, is that a sustainable model? You know, especially when you're trying to capacity build within, you know, a small developing country. So we need to think about how we are going to train trainers, I think.
So that, back on the scheduling and logistics then, we talked earlier before we had the exciting break about architecture, the 2 weeks to get the job done and allow an additional week for the whatever extras in terms of the socialization and such. And there could be a day or two stoppage when there's some big issue that has to be resolved. And then another week to just account for the travel to and from and retrieving material from FedEx and that sort of thing that will be a factor. So 4 weeks. Chuck and somebody with Chuck, equipment, and in preset with the information architecture so that can all be worked out in advance. There's one last thing that I will take on, and that's the authorization issues associated with airspace operations. Chuck, we're probably talking about line of sight operations here along the coast, starting at some point, half mile up the coast and back to get enough overlap, and then move the launch point down a half mile and repeat, kind of circling the island that way. Okay. Lanai is a good case, a good practice case, I think, with the kind of topography you're going to have, combination of rocky coastline as well as sand beaches, I would think. And so we need to think in terms of that within line of sight. And the question then to me is, okay, how is the airspace regulated in those islands? And if it'd probably be different from island to island, depending on what temporary flight restrictions have been created in the past, depending on what DOD efforts have been going on there. So we'll have to discover that. So I'll take that on to figure out what the authorization aspects are for airspace. We have to certainly stay within those guidelines. Okay. And that may actually influence the schedule, depending on how complex or simple that becomes. But that's another place for PACOM. If we had a PACOM connection going earlier, might have been able to help in terms of getting airspace access. What do you know about that, Chuck? And as you've been building your coursework in terms of airspace authorization in areas like the Western Pacific?
I don't really know when it comes to Samoa. I don't think they really have like the same sort of regulations that we have here in our national airspace. I think more so is dealing with the local government or kingdoms and just getting permission to fly in certain areas and getting their blessing.
That's probably is the relationship between the U.S. and these various island groups. More than likely, as Chuck says, has a lot of influence on how that is. Samoa, you mentioned Samoa. Believe it or not, American Samoa is on the same aeronautical sectional chart with Hawaii. So American Samoa and Hawaii are commonly within the FAA environment as far as the Pacific is concerned.
Marshall Islands, I would imagine, right? Marshall Islands, probably the same thing?
No, they're a protectorate, right? Not so much isn't that a different relationship that they have with us relative to American Samoa?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the legal because I'm going to get out of my depth, but as far as I understand it, they have a compact.
I'll hit the negative, so bring it down on that. So.
They have a compact of free association, and but they're a fully sovereign nation with voting rights in the United States.
So they more than likely have their own authorities, and they're probably to some extent related to and aligned with FAA policies because they do have air traffic going in. But I'll take that on and go find out, okay?
That's a good question. And it's going to be a big job, I think, Ted.
Well, that's okay. Someone's got to do it. We can't go forward without that, but this is getting good. So we'll get back and talk about how this might actually occur and the timing where it makes sense, the threats that are causing the timing to be what they are, and any other broad pictures that this kind of social and technical work with educational component has as a sort of a reference or a standard to begin spreading around the rest of the Pacific. When we get back from our next break.
Thank you.
Next and last.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on Think Tech. This show is so very dear to my heart. We talk with artists of various different ilk here about the process that they go through for their art. So we talk about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they do it. And it's a show that is inspiring. This is what I hear from people all the time. And a show that will teach you something, sometimes something about yourself. I hope you'll join us. The show is Center Stage. It's on Think Tech every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. We'll see you then.
Aloha! How you doing? It's me, Angus McTech, wishing you to welcome and join us to see us on Hibachi Talk on Think Tech Hawaii. Join my co-hosts, Gordo the Tech Czar and Andrew the Security Guy, every Friday from 1300 to 1345. We look forward to seeing you. We'll talk tech and we'll have some wee bit of fun. And remember, let your wing gang free wherever you be. Aloha!
Back live, folks. Ted Ralston here at downtown Honolulu with our guest in the studio, Gregg Nakano. Gregg, again, thanks so much for coming on. Chuck Devaney in Washington, D.C. Always a pleasure having you on, Chuck. Hey, your canoe is still in the yard, man. When you come through on the way to Majuro, let's spend a day here and go out to the reef.
I'd love to.
All right? And we'll take Gregg with us, as a matter of fact.
I'd love to.
Okay. So we're talking here quite actively about a program putting together of UAS-based information collection system, information architecture and analysis system to support some ideas that you have been discussing here actually over the last couple of years, Gregg, since you've been on the show. If we do this, we're talking about, once again, a couple of people from DC and the equipment that Chuck has, appropriate software associated with, and a tour or a deployment of some kind to the reference island you're thinking of as Majuro, right, to start with. Who else do we have to connect with? Or who else do we have to talk to? How do we actually move forward?
Well, you know, I think Chuck hit the nail on the head when he said this has got to be a whole community effort and it has to basically empower people from the bottom up. If we wanted just to start with, say, a pilot project with the College of the Marshall Islands and UH and build it that way, we could do that. But what we'd want to do is, like you said, make sure that it is scalable and then we can replicate that with some of the other universities and colleges in the region so that it really does help that next generation grow up with this technology so they're not afraid of it and they actually can maximize its potential.
You know, it's bringing back thoughts when Chuck was first in the Philippines a couple, 3 years ago, and that same exact issue. It was kind of a, you know, stay out was the first approach. It looks like it's a piece of military gear, we don't want it. And Chuck and his folks worked magic in a fairly short time and turned it around from, instead of staying out, they said, hey, come over here. Including a letter that got issued by the Philippine Defense Authorities that added this functionality, UAVs, to disaster management, became an official policy by virtue of the work that Chuck and others had done. So there'll probably be something similar here where we have to go through some socialization and then turn into standards and to sort of an approval process for moving forward. And I tell you, it's exciting because that's exactly what Ethan Allen does in the work he does, and he's not here, so we're setting expectations high. Ethan, I hope you're out there watching this, and we'll catch him as soon as he's back. And then again, Brennan, who is a brilliant guy, thinking of the how this turns into an educational program and how that then becomes the means by which this is continued into the future.
Again, going back to the very beginning of the conversation where Chuck brought up doing longitudinal studies, and I think talking to a couple people, they don't really have the digital elevation models readily available. And so if we were able to help College of the Marshall Islands or UH work together to begin doing this and building their own systems, then we could be doing these mapping exercises on a yearly, on a monthly, maybe even a weekly basis, so that you could begin really watching how coastal inundation is tied to sea level rise and is impacting their local infrastructure. And that kind of visualization of climate change might be really powerful in helping people understand the urgency that these people are facing and have a better understanding of the impacts that it has here in Hawaii.
So digital elevation model, once again, that came up in your very first email, and that's come up several times in this conversation as a product that would be very understandable and very useful by people, by administrators, by people thinking about the future. it seems to me the next step behind the digital elevation model is something about the soil conditions and the geology of the soil in terms of how much of a threat is there associated with slopes and such as they become wetter as the sea level rise goes on. So there's some soil hydrology or soil mechanics or something going on here too, which, by the way, Darrell Long, I hope you're watching the show, that's what Darrell Long does. I mean, that's what his actual training was in. So digital elevation model affected by, with the landforms affected by the sea level rise would be the deliverable product out of this activity, with the local agencies being able to carry on the collection and the local university being able to carry on the analysis.
There's a lot of different variables. There's a lot of different variables that you should consider as well. Wave modeling as well, which is something that Chip Fletcher's group is doing a lot of nowadays. And then, they've got kind of the whole long-term variability study thing worked out. And until now, where we've been able to cost-effectively acquire imagery to do short-term variability studies, now we can actually start to see those short-term differences as well.
So there's a big picture forming up here. Now, one thought, Primo's coming up in about a month, right?
Right.
Is this a subject for discussion with the right people at Primo?
Absolutely. I mean, if we could have some sort of executive summary or some sort of plan that we could pitch to the representatives who are coming to Primo. And NOAA, like I said, I'm the stupidest guy in the room. So, I mean, you have the smart people at NOAA.
That's why we have the wire on you.
You have the smart people at SOAS, you have the smart people at NOAA. If we came up and brought the pieces together, and then we're able to figure out, all right, well, how do we bring in College of the Marshall Islands, or how do we bring in the local populations so that they're actually driving it, and it's a pull from their side rather than a push from our side.
I recall at last year's Primo, people from Samoa had a very similar problem in mind, and I believe somebody from NOAA here even went down to Samoa after that. In fact, I think they took my GoPro with them as part of the recording process. And so we've had that one experience. So what we should do is reconnect with that bunch and then look at the attendance list or the invitee list and see if there's the right bunch of people here to put a side meeting together with.
That sounds like a plan.
Okay, so we're talking about like a white paper based thing or something like that a month from now. Primo, and actually, you'll be heading to the Majuro right after that, or is that right after Primo?
It is. I'm actually trying to look at what the health impacts of climate change and sea level rise are going to be, and the Pacific Island Health Officers Association, that is run by Emi Chutaro, is going to be holding their annual conference in Majuro in 21 to 24 March. So what I'm hoping to do is go and join them and listen and learn about how they're perceiving the health impacts that climate change brings. And that's hopefully going to be tied into being able to first map what sea level rise is doing to their islands.
If Skip Burkle was on this show, he would laud very much what you're saying, because everything in his perspective comes back to public health. That is a well-done program, whatever it may be, food, hydrology, transportation, logistics, whatever, its measurable value is in public health. And if the public health complaints slow down or go away, you must have got it right. If the public health complaints increase, then apparently we've worked this thing backwards and we have to go re-engineer it. But health impacts and measurements of success based on public health is a really high social and public value factor to think of here, rather than the technical alone. So,
well, Skip is one of my old mentors, and if I ever say anything smart, it's probably something he taught me.
Or because we hit with the right wire. So this is cool. So Chuck, I think we're talking about putting together a white paper of some kind. Here with some pictures and a couple of pages of narrative. Who else, Chuck, should we be involving here in this circle of three right now to pull this thing together completely?
You should definitely probably talk to the people at the Coastal Geology Group. So Matt Barbie, Tiffany Anderson, Haunani Kane, Shelley Habel, that whole group. They're already working on this issue. definitely, they don't have the technology, but they have the modeling perspective down to a quote unquote science. Also, I mean, I could, definitely have to bring in my chief scientist, Jim Blanchard, who is, he's been my enabler. He, lets me play with a lot of different sensors and lets me build stuff that might, be of use for this package. He's already kind of hammered out the whole expedition kit for a lot of different climate conditions, one being the tropics. So that would be somebody that we would definitely want to bring in.
Okay.
And then, if you need any help from anybody in the geography department, they've definitely got some capability there as well.
You're actually in the coastal geology department, are you not? Isn't that where you're getting your master's degree?
In SOAS, yes. And Dr. Fletcher was one of my
Okay.
professors, so
So Matt Barbie and that bunch are known to you, and we've got that connection already there?
should be.
Okay. This is a test, right? I hope they're not watching. Anyway, so Chuck, so the entire coastal geology department is already moving that direction. This would then be information that would supplement the framework of analysis that they're coming up with and produce more quickly the results that are necessary. And we have the NOAA connections. I'll recall who that was, and they went down to Samoa last year after Primo, get those guys going. And then FAA, I'll take care of connections with the FAA and see what we learn from them about the means by which we have to pre-authorize operations and such.
Okay.
So we got ourselves a good little task here, Chuck and Greg, and it's been cool. 45 minutes after we started this conversation, we have a program. And the only thing missing in the program to make it work is we said $10,000 for equipment and a month of salary and some travel for a couple of people. So we're looking at 20 grand, something like that, to get this thing off and rolling and produce a lot of value for a very little investment and have the enabling capability remaining behind as well as the data remaining behind to bring up the capacity and capability in the local environment.
Thank you so much for putting all this together.
So thanks, Greg, for being the inspiration for all this, and Chuck for being the guy behind the scene with the soldering iron and UAV components and parts all over the place. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this. This is what this show is all about. It's not me. It's the people who come on it and the ideas that come up from it and how we can push them forward. So I guess what we're going to have to do is have you come back right after Primo, and let's talk about how this is actually going to work. We have all these deals in place and money coming in and such like that to make it all happen. But Greg and Chuck, would you just say in our closing minute here, take Chuck first. Chuck, what do you want to have the people watching this show take away from them on this particular episode?
This particular episode, I would say, this is definitely another good use of this technology. With it being a really controversial topic, even still, I think that this show should definitely display a good use of this technology.
Great. And Greg, you, sir.
I'll just riff off of what Chuck said. Is basically the best example, I think, of how we take something from the military-industrial complex and transform it into something that serves the human security network and really does good things and improves human security around the world.
That's great. And you just said something military, so that's something we have to assign here to either you or me is to talk to PACOM. Why don't we both do it? I'll talk to Sujay Chang at, I think at Marfor Pac, and if you find your connections, we'll see if we can get them into PACOM and see what comes out of it.
Sounds good.
Greg, thanks a lot for coming on. Chuck, aloha.
See you guys. Aloha.
The canoe's still in the yard. And,
yeah.
and once again, thanks everyone. And folks, we'll see you next Friday.